Beijing, northern China. It has always been one of the great cities of the world, among the biggest and most populous. Today, as the capital of modern China, the second largest economy in the world, it is a centre of business and commerce. Its citizens are proud and busy as they go about their day-to-day affairs. The central areas of the city, the former Imperial Forbidden City and Tiananmen Square, are always thronged with local people and tourists. The sites are popular with citizens understandably proud of their history. Beijing has not always been a peaceful city. The history of the city has included great dramas, and unfolding events have often placed it at the centre of world events, as indeed its imperial dynasties believed it to be. A little over 100 years ago, it became the focus of the world's attention. On 16 July 1900, readers of the Daily Mail were presented with a shocking headline. The story went on to describe how in the diplomatic legations in Beijing, standing together as the sun rose fully, the little remaining band, all Europeans, met death stubbornly. As one man fell, others advanced, and finally overcome by overwhelming odds, every one of the Europeans remaining was put to the sword, fighting to the last for the helpless women and children who were to be butchered over their dead bodies.
The media of 1900 spread this story around the world. In the United States, readers of the New York Times read that as the legations are about to fall to the Chinese, the defenders went mad and killed all their women and children with revolvers. These stories were completely untrue. It was reporting at its most sensational. Yet such stories caught the imagination and the indignation of millions of Western readers. In Beijing in 1900, there were rioting mobs, but there were no overwhelming hordes and no wave after wave of assailants. No European women or children died in the violence in the legations. None. The total number of European men killed in the legations was 60, but there were many more fatalities among Chinese Christians who had sought sanctuary in the diplomatic compounds and who died of illness and malnutrition because they were not included in the rationing system.
Europeans wanted to believe that they were threatened by the evils of the Yellow Peril, as illustrated by this picture of God's angel warning the nations of Europe about the gathering storm in Asia. It is not as if the events of July-August in northern China have been entirely forgotten, for the so-called siege of the legations in Beijing has been compared to the great sieges of history, like the siege of Jerusalem, or the siege of Constantinople, or even the more recent siege of Paris by the Prussians in 1870. Somehow, a fairly minor event when dozens died on one side and a few hundred on the other has been magnified to the level of great events of history when hundreds of thousands perished in hard-fought sieges. It is the reality and the proper place of the events in 1900 in Beijing that have been forgotten by those who have had the recording of popular history. Popular images have been raised that have obscured what really occurred. That year 1900 saw European imperial power at its peak. Rudyard Kipling wrote about the white man's burden, and the man in the street in London and Paris and Berlin imagined they felt its weight. What were the facts? It was a fact that in 1900, China was crushed by the foreign powers, much like a man brought down by a pack of dogs, as in this cartoon.
In 1898, in reaction to the oppression of colonial powers, a rebellious movement emerged mainly among the peasants of northeast China. The Chinese called the movement the Yihuchuan, Society of Righteous Fists. The Europeans called it the Boxer Movement. They were fanatical nationalists and they killed a number of Western missionaries and a far greater number of Chinese Christians.
In most provinces, imperial viceroys dispersed the Boxers and executed many, but the movement was especially strong in the northern areas around Beijing. Thousands of Boxers entered the imperial capital and demanded the Chinese government expel the Westerners who had been exploiting the country through a series of unequal treaties since 1842. There was much bitterness over European excesses and desire to make them respect Chinese rights and traditions, and to bring them under Chinese law, as illustrated in a local picture of the time. They even hoped to expel the armies of foreigners, sending them packing, cringing before the strength of Chinese arms, as in this somewhat hopeful portrayal. By this time, the Qing dynasty that had ruled China for 250 years had become very weak, and its survival was in doubt. The emperor was Guangxu, but effective government was in the hands of the Dowager Empress Cixi. In January and April 1900, she issued edicts that suggested some support for the Boxers and their aims. In early June, the European powers collectively sent 450 Marines to Beijing to secure the legations against the threat posed by the Boxers in the city. The British minister, Sir Claude MacDonald, took the lead role in organising the international force. From this point, the reporting of events became obscured and the interpretation of facts more open to question. To the Western media, events were reported as a siege, with the outnumbered garrison holding off attack after attack. Not unnaturally, these accounts focused on acts of heroism and desperate defence. The British public of 1900 was a generation raised on tales of adventure and courage in distant places. Wars seemed to consist of uprisings and sieges, which resulted in the inevitable triumph of British arms. The reporting became more passionate when there were white women and children at the mercy of foreigners. There exists some limited film footage of the time, grainy film of colonial forces. These troops have German officers. It is possibly in Shandong where the Boxers first appeared. Here is the bombardment of Taku forts. Then there is film purportedly of Allied forces advancing on Beijing. However, given the desperate fighting of the time, it is more likely that the film was made soon afterwards. Most of the soldiers are Russian. It was not long after 1900 that the film studios produced their version of events, and the reality became submerged by the romantic. This is footage from one of the earliest films dramatised for Western audiences. The Boxers are the villains. Heroism by Western missionaries and soldiers abounds.
There is one source that presented an objective view, and that's because the source was a visual one and portrayed people and things as they really were. One of the participants of the events in Beijing of June to August 1900 was a young language student who took over 100 photographs and recorded the events. His record portrays the realities of what happened in Beijing. For example, what were the Boxers really like?
This is a picture of a boxer in the Western press, heavily armed, on horseback, in a kind of uniform, about to loose an arrow at his enemies, and it invokes images of the hordes of Genghis Khan. This is an actual photo of boxers, some of 18 captured during the violence around the legations. These are men, all barefoot, obviously poor, probably from the slums of the city, tempted out to riot in the hope of some pickings. They are not disciplined fighters. The student who took this photograph was Lancelot Giles, and he passed his 22nd birthday in the British legation in the middle of the events of June 1900. He also wrote a short journal at the same time. He is pictured here with a group of his fellow student interpreters. In later years, during a career as a diplomat, he became vice-consul and consul in various parts of China and died in 1934 while British consul in Tianjin. During the events of June to August 1900, Giles was busy with his camera. Here is a group of British Marines posing next to their Colt machine gun. Note that the barricades were very flimsy and could have been pushed aside by a determined attack. The legation guards had the support of machine guns and light artillery, whereas those assaulting them had none, except for a short period in August. Here a group of Russian Marines and their officer posed next to a low barrier which, once again, could not have kept a disciplined foe at bay. Despite Western media reports that the Chinese closely surrounded the legations in overwhelming numbers, he explores the positions of the Boxers and militia and photographs them with their permission. He is clearly outside the fortifications when photographing surrounding areas, which he could not do if the Chinese were continually firing on and sniping at those within. This photo of Russians at their posts suggests that some were bored, waiting for something exciting to happen. Most of the Chinese imperial soldiers surrounding the legation compound were not hostile, as evidenced by Giles' photos of soldiers and their positions. Giles records in his journal how he and other groups from the legations had ventured into the city and countryside and shot any Chinese who threatened them.